This is Launching Your Daughter podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Now, here is today's episode. Episode 22. Today's guest is Jill Castle, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist, and she has over 25 years of experience with babies, toddlers, children, and teens in a variety of settings, from private practice and consulting to being an author and a writer. Jill is sought after as one of America's childhood nutrition experts. And another little fun fact about Jill is she and her family used to live here in Indiana and even in the Indianapolis area. You'll see on her website she was actually interviewed by one of the local TV stations here. Having this conversation brought back lots of memories for me and how I learned to cook. My parents encouraged me and my best friend when I was young to help out with the meal. I cooked with my grandmother during the holidays too. I loved baking food and then gradually grew into cooking, as Jill describes in this episode. I hope you enjoy this episode and encourage your teen daughter to come into the kitchen and learn a life skill. Well, welcome everybody. Today my guest is Jill Castle, and she is a registered dietitian nutritionist. And I hope I said that correctly, Jill. And
You did.
Good. And I'm so excited to have you on today because we're going to talk about nutrition, getting teens into the kitchen, and I'm just looking forward to having this conversation. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm wondering if you would tell our audience just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So first and foremost, I'm a mom to 4 teenagers, 2 of which are in college. But the rest of my life I spend as a registered dietitian. I specialize in pediatric nutrition, which basically means I take care of babies all the way up through teens and even sometimes young adults. And I work in a variety of settings. I have a private practice one day a week. I'm a blogger, an author. I just started a podcast, and I do quite a bit of speaking and consulting as well. So I work full time.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you definitely do with all of that. Definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's great. Well, I know today we're going to talk a little more kind of about teenagers and setting your teen up to succeed, whether they're still living at home or getting ready to launch and go off into college. And I know you have written some blogs about kind of getting your teenager into the kitchen. And I'm wondering if you could share just a little bit more about how that works and trying to set up, I guess, more awareness regarding what is healthy eating and what maybe is not for our parents and teens out there.
Sure. So I believe that cooking is a life skill, and ideally we've had kids in the kitchen since they were toddlers and even preschoolers, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And I know for myself and many of the parents I work with, as college is looming, parents start to realize that they might be sending their kids off to college without any skills in the kitchen. So it is a really important skill to have. I believe I saw a statistic a couple of years ago that stated that of today's parents, only 26% know how to cook. So that is a pretty staggering percentage. And when we think about the implications of that, and we look at it on a big, broad perspective, if parents don't know how to cook, then it's really unlikely that they're teaching their children how to cook. And so that cycle begins.
Yeah.
So it's really, I know, it's really important for older teens, younger teens, to really get into the kitchen and start to experiment. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the biggest piece of advice for parents is to let them experiment. Mm-hmm. They're not going to be professional cooks. Yeah. They are going to burn food. They're going to smoke up the kitchen. They're going to create food combinations that are weird and maybe something you would never eat. Uh-huh. But at the same time, they will learn so much. I mean, not only just how to read a recipe or how to actually cook something, bake something, steam, stir fry. I mean, all this terminology, it doesn't even resonate with teens unless they are in there in the kitchen trying to do it. So
Yeah, and they not only learn that skill, that confidence building is huge when they feel good about what they've created and that they've tried something new. And I was laughing earlier when you said smoking up the kitchen. I remember some of my teen clients that I've talked to in the past, and they're like, yeah, I got to cook. And yeah, so the first time didn't go so well. And mom and dad went, no, thank you. But I tried it again and did some new stuff. And the parents were like, yeah, it was really good. So the teen felt really good about what they had created, and parents were truly impressed by the creativeness and that sense of adventure that their teenager had done in the kitchen. So it was really fun to see that.
Right. And, I have my own teenagers and I work with a lot of teenagers, and it seems like I notice a trend of how kids and teens like to experiment. And oftentimes they want to cook or bake sweets.
Yes.
And this can bum parents out sometimes. But remember, baking is science.
Yes.
There are recipes to be followed, measurements that need to be accurate. And when that happens, you actually get a final product that is edible. Those are really important lessons. Baking is a science. Cooking is more flexible. You have more room for mistakes and a little bit more freedom to get experimental. So baking, cooking are typically the order in which I see kids and teens wanting to experiment with food. But I also like to remind teens that just assembling food, making food combinations that doesn't require cooking or baking is an important skill too. Yeah. So if you think about, salads are just chopping up different vegetables and fruit and seeds and nuts and combining them all together and experimenting with dressings, making homemade dressings. That's a skill as well, and it's pretty simple.
Yeah, but it's as you were saying, it's really important to do that as well. Along with, I remember I had flashbacks. I'm like, oh yeah, I used to do a lot of baking when I was younger too, because there was a recipe to follow, and then it went into the cooking. And with that assembly piece, we did more as a family function, and it is important because it's like, oh, I could put this together with this and try that, and it's all the skills that you need when you actually leave home, because it's a lifelong learning process and needed.
Absolutely. You don't want to have to rely on restaurants for the rest of your life to make your food.
Correct.
or packaged meals. We do want teenagers, especially who are launching from the nest, to have some skills so they can feed themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to whether it's restaurant food or the processed food, the nutritional value is not nearly as high or strong as when you've prepared it yourself and you don't necessarily know what goes into it. And so when they see, maybe they have their own little garden at home, or they take part in a community garden, they can see the process of growing those plants or those items and then preparing it, and you get it from the beginning to an end. And that, again, really helps them set themselves up for when they have their own home, or if they want to do container gardening, they can do that as well and get their food that way too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's great stuff.
It's all good. But I think, from a parenting standpoint, you have to be sort of willing and able to set them loose in the kitchen and just be supportive. They don't, teens are old enough. They can figure out a recipe. They can figure things out. But to be supportive in that you're there for them should they have any questions or are looking for guidance, or your experiences in the past. That's really the role of the parent when you're parenting a teen in the kitchen.
Yeah. Again, that support. Are there ways, I guess, that you help support the parents if they're trying to empower their teen daughter in having these skills, but yet they're afraid because maybe they're like part of that statistics you talked about, only 26% know how to cook. Are there ways or guidance that you give the parents to help, I guess, empower them and support them in trusting that process and beginning that process?
I think, yeah, communication is a big one. And, having a relationship with your teenager that's less controlling and
Yeah.
more as a guide or supporter or somebody who makes suggestions, I think is important.
Yeah.
But also being a mom of teenagers, I also recognize that sometimes you can make suggestions and your teen is just not interested at all or doesn't have the time.
Yep.
I know that teens today are super busy during the school
Yeah.
week. And so I oftentimes will suggest that on the weekends to grab some time, let your teenager make breakfast or let them be in charge of a particular, part of the meal if you do a family meal on the weekends, or even to make something ahead of time for the week for their own lunch.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's so wise because you're right. I mean, with the sports and academic things, they're nonstop during the week, and it can feel like another stressor if that is put on top of them. So whether it's planning something over the weekend for the week of food, or being able to cook for the family or with the family, doing it more on the weekend. I like that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, are there any other tips or suggestions regarding really trying to help teens gain an understanding of why this cooking skill is so important, or why nutrition is important to them at this stage of life and going forward?
Sure. I mean, I think that what I oftentimes see with my own clients is that they are a little lost when they go off to college because they've had oftentimes somebody making all the choices for them, or they've had perhaps parents who have been completely hands off, and these kids have had complete freedom to eat out, buy lunch at school. So they've put themselves in situations where the choices are already pretty much made for them. And so when they go off to college, in addition to all of that, there's quite a bit of talk, especially amongst teen girls, about gaining weight in college. So there tends to be this little freak out moment that they have about, what am I going to eat, and what's a healthy meal, and am I going to do this right? And this generalized fear of perhaps gaining weight that they don't want to gain. So I oftentimes will speak with teenagers about just some really general concepts like food balance. So I don't tend to get into this food is bad and don't eat it, or this one is uber healthy and you should be eating this every day. I don't go there with teenagers, but what I do try to emphasize to them is that every individual has a healthy balance that they can strike for their own body. And that healthy balance is different for everyone. So helping each person figure out the right balance of foods is important. And just going through the different food groups and how many fruits and vegetables should you be eating a day? That's a really basic concept, but a lot of teenagers don't know that they should be having, 5 cups of fruits and vegetables a day if they can, in some combination, shape, or form. And if they're not having that, then working towards bumping those fruits and vegetables up in their diet. It will fill them up, help them with their appetite, and help keep the calories overall in control.
Yeah, I was laughing. I was shaking my head earlier because I was like, oh, I just had a recent conversation with a couple teen girls about fruits and vegetables and fruits in general. And they're like, what? Well, I eat fruit roll-ups. I'm like, no, it's not quite a fruit.
No.
Yeah, but it's more that education of how many servings, and what is good for them to, again, get that nutritional value and that, like you saying, the healthy balance of it. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
And then I also talk about just structuring their eating. And I oftentimes will, encourage them not to skip meals, because we know from the research that when teenagers skip meals, they tend to get over hungry later in the day, and they make poor food choices, or they can overeat. So having, breakfast, something for breakfast every day, lunch, midday, dinner, at a reasonable hour in the evening, and even snacks throughout the day that are nutritious that can help keep that appetite in check and keep these, teens and college kids fueled, their brains really fueled for learning and remembering.
Yeah. I think that right there, that fueled for learning and the remembering piece of it, there seems to be a disconnect, at least with some of the girls that I've worked with, where they don't understand that, as you're saying, having that structured kind of eating schedule is really helpful, because then their mood level stays more solid, their memory stays up, they can retain information better, then recall it better when they're not hungry. And they don't seem to get that connection. It's like, yeah, that's why, the food is fuel for the body and the brain. It's really important. Yeah. Awesome.
Right. And then I would say just the last thing that I like to review with these teens that are leaving the nest is just to review where alcohol and sweets, quite frankly, fit into the diet.
Yeah.
And I'm always amazed that teenagers really do not register alcohol as a calorie source. And not only as a calorie source, but as sort of a diminishing barrier to eating, to excess eating. So under the influence, teens and college kids tend to eat more.
Correct.
And tend to not make healthy choices. So I do like to go over that with teens, because it really is something that they need to be paying attention to in terms of striking a healthy balance for their diet. But obviously for other reasons as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great, because it really sounds like, from where you come from and kind of what you and I were talking about before we were doing the recording, is just really trying to empower the teens and the parents of what is available regarding kind of the nutrition, and kind of creating a plan to help them succeed, whether they're still living at home or they've been launched and they're off to college or just have left the family home, giving them the skills and the awareness to make healthier choices. Yeah.
Right.
Love it.
Yeah. It's all important. It's very important stuff.
It is. And I know in many high schools there are, health and nutrition classes, but it's a small, maybe one semester type of information, and it goes over so many different areas of health that nutrition isn't necessarily the main focus of it. And I know for some of the girls that I've worked with, they may have taken like what used to be called home ec class. I think it's now called something slightly different, where they're gaining some of those skills. But as you said, a lot of parents don't even have those skills. So this is just so important that our families out there understand. It's like, getting back into the home kitchen is truly important.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing too is it doesn't have to be a masterpiece. It doesn't have to look like an entree from Food Network. It can be so simple. It can be a grilled cheese sandwich and a cup of soup with some fruit. I mean, I think that's the reality of today's world. It has to be, we want it to be healthy, but it also has to be convenient, and it has to be easy to do. Right. And fortunately, there are a lot of foods that fit that bill. It's just trying to come up with a list of those things that you are able and can support your teen in learning and doing.
And that, you just hit that, creating that list. To me, I often will encourage parents and their teens to sit down and kind of brainstorm some of the family favorites, and then maybe creating like a month, meal plan out there. Not necessarily they have to stick to it exactly all the time, but kind of giving themselves permission to go, oh yeah, we really like this, or hey, I'm really good at cooking this and I like to cook it. So it helps the teen, again, continue that skill level and take some of the pressure off the parents of having to do all the cooking all the time. But it also just looks at the family meals as like, as you said, it doesn't need to be a 7-course meal. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's having something that is easy and nutritious available to the family members.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, are there certain like books or websites, or I know you have lots of information out on your website, which we'll definitely talk about here towards the end, and I'll have that on the show notes as well for the listeners to be able to go out and view. But are there certain, I guess, books or blogs or whatever that you direct the families or teens to kind of gain more, I guess whether it's recipes or insight into nutritional or healthy eating?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a few really great websites that focus on recipes and food for the whole family.
Okay.
And one that's my favorite is by the Meal Makeover Moms, and they're both registered dietitians, but they take traditional meals and they basically healthify them. So they might take macaroni and cheese, but they'll switch the ingredients around so it's a healthier version. So they have a podcast also that's really great.
Oh, cool.
But that's a great one. In terms of teen nutrition, there aren't a whole lot of online resources available that just focus on teen nutrition.
Okay.
I wish there were more. I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly try to focus on it, but I also focus on the other age groups too. So I have
Right.
quite a bit on my site. But there's cookbooks are great inspiration for teenagers. Cooking shows are great inspiration. But I think that mostly, I love the idea that you suggested where it's make a list of your favorite foods and then you can sort of hunt down on the internet some super simple recipes. And the internet is flooded with easy, simple recipes. So you just have to do a little bit of a Google hunt on the types of foods that you might want to make and then print out a recipe and do it and call it your own.
Yep, absolutely. Because I know that they have various different recipe sites that I go on that sometimes, you get just suggestions from other people who have created it and said, oh, instead of this ingredient, I use this. And, it's like, there it is. So you start with something and then you can modify that and create, as you said, your own, which is awesome.
Exactly.
Well, I'm curious, is there anything else that you wanted to share that maybe I've kind of missed in today's conversation about, getting our teens into the kitchen and giving them that life skill before they launch off into college or outside the family home? Is there anything else that you wanted to add that I've missed?
The only other thing I would say is just to encourage all families to have fun with it. There really aren't any rules about cooking, and teenagers are still on the learning curve. In terms of nutrition, in terms of cooking, in terms of their own eating, their own knowledge of what works for their bodies and what doesn't work so much for their bodies. So embrace the fact that your teenager is still on the learning curve. They can learn a lot from you, but they're going to learn a lot from the rest of the world too. And just to be there for them to answer any questions or help guide them or steer them down the right path is a good piece of advice, I think, because when kids go off on their independent path, mistakes do happen. It's part and parcel. That's how kids learn, and to be tolerant of those, but to be there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was smiling when you said you're just trying to play in the kitchen. And I've had lots of previous episodes where we've talked quite a bit about how play is not only important for our teenagers, but for parents and couples. And just to remember, sometimes it's just having some fun to lighten things up a little bit. And nothing has to be perfect because there is no perfect.
Exactly. Perfect is overrated.
It is. It absolutely is. Definitely. Well, Jill, can you tell our listeners how can they get a hold of you or find you? And I know you've also got an exciting thing that you just launched. So if you could tell our listeners a little more about how they could get a hold of you.
Sure. So I have a website, and it is www.jillcastle.com. And on my website, all my services are there. My blog is there, and my brand new baby, new baby of the family, called The Nourished Child, and that's my new podcast. And that is available on iTunes and Stitcher Radio and all the normal podcast outlets. But The Nourished Child is a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs that are inevitable during that 18-year childhood, and how to best deal with them so that we are raising and nourishing wonderful kids.
Oh, I love it. And that's so exciting. I will definitely have that on the show notes and put the links and all of that out there for our listeners.
Awesome.
So yeah, that is so cool. And again, I really like how you work with also just the little ones, which again is helping give the parents support and creating that foundation so that as kids continue to get older and turn into the teenagers, right, they already have some of these skills and a better understanding because the parents have better understanding in that foundation to go from. So that is just so exciting and awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank
Keeps
you.
me getting up every morning.
Absolutely. Because I mean, yeah, having the passion for it and just like, oh, I love doing what I do. It is a good thing. That's for sure. Well, thank you again, Jill, for being on today. So appreciate you taking the time and giving our listeners some great information about how to encourage their teen daughters and teen sons to get into the kitchen, do some experimentation, and cooking a few meals or preparing a few meals for the family and then for themselves when they go off into college. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. It's been a pleasure.
If you liked today's episode, please go to iTunes or to Stitcher and subscribe. You can also give me a rating and review of the podcast. Thank you for listening to Launching Your Daughter with Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist. For more information or to stay up to date, go to launchingyourdaughter.com. You can sign up for my email list or join my Facebook group. Thank you.